Hi there, Rob Mazes here, speaking to you today on behalf of Envato Tuts Plus. And we're looking at mastering, home mastering in this video. And if you haven't read the previous part of this series where I cover home mastering, the thought process behind it, and all of the various steps involved, then I recommend you go check that out first, because that's going to give you a good overview of what we're doing here. But in this video today, I want to focus on dynamic processing. So we're going to talk about gain staging, compression, and limiting most of all. Now, first of all, I just want to mention that I don't necessarily recommend mastering your own music at home, or even mastering anything at home, in fact, because if you're a mixer or a musician who produces your own music, or anything like that, it's a good idea to have someone else master your work, because they'll be able to pick up on anything that you've missed. And a lot of the time, if it's your own music that you're mixing, or a mix you've been working on for a while, you start to lose objectivity and you lose sight of the bigger picture from listening to the same track over and over again. So sending it off to someone else to master is a great way to just get a final check. And it's so cheap nowadays, you can get a track mastered for a very small amount. And they'll be able to do it professionally. So in most cases, I do actually recommend sending off your track for mastering, which completely goes against the idea of this video. But I know there are going to be situations where you're pushed for time, or if you're just putting out a demo, maybe you just want to share it with your bandmates, or maybe it is just a short EP that you're not putting a lot of money into, you just want to get it out there. Or if you just have no budget, you simply can't afford to send off your tracks for mastering. Those are all situations where mastering your own tracks is going to be acceptable, as long as you realise that what we're talking about here isn't technically mastering to an extent. What we're doing here is simply a final check. We're going to do some stereo bus processing, which simply means processing the entire audio file, the stereo audio file, as opposed to processing the individual elements. We're going to use some EQ, some compression and limiting to make sure the track is loud enough to compete with professional records, and then we're also going to check it against some references just to make sure it's not too bass heavy, or it doesn't sound dull and lifeless, or there's not too much top end, things like that. So this process of mastering is more like stereo bus processing, but it still helps a lot, and it will still make better mixes out of your tracks. But it's not really mastering. Proper mastering needs to be done in a professionally treated studio with expensive equipment, someone that's been doing it for years and is a dedicated mastering engineer. It's slightly different. But for now, let's just talk about dynamics. So in the last part of this series, I went over the overall picture. In this video, I'm going to talk about dynamics, and then in the next video, which is coming soon, I'm going to talk to you about EQ, referencing, and final checks. Now, the reason I have a mix open here rather than a stereo file is because the first thing I want to talk about is gain staging. And this is a really important part of any mix, of any master. And if you get this wrong, your mix isn't going to be loud, it's not going to sound good, it's not going to sound clear and open and have a nice amount of dynamics. Instead, if your gain staging is bad, you can start clipping your mix, you'll lose all your headroom, that means you'll lose your dynamic range. And then when you go to start adding compression and limiting when you're mastering your own tracks, you're going to have nothing to work with, and you'll see why in a second. So the first thing you want to do is, if you are mastering your own mix, make sure your levels are good. And by that, I mean you want your stereo bus, which here I'm actually using a submaster, but we can refer to this master channel as well. We want this ideally to be around -18, which is around here. And we don't want to be peaking higher than -6. Now, in the analog days, you would push it to 0, but this is completely different. We're working with digital audio here. So you don't really want to go above -6. Consider that your top ceiling at this point in time. Instead, you want to be averaging around -18, ideally, and then that means you've got lots of headroom between that and -6. If you occasionally go up to -10, that's fine. Even if it does go up to -6, that's still going to be okay, but ideally you want it around there. So let's have a listen to this track. So you can see it's occasionally pushing up to, it's probably around -11, -12. Mostly we're sitting in this gap here, which is perfectly fine. Now, if that isn't the case, you just need to go through your mix and knock some gain off of everything. So you can see here I've got a trim plugin at the top of most of these channels, just taking off 10 dB. That's all I did. I just copied it across. Some of them did require more. So somewhere I'm sure we'll find one that's got a bit more. Let's have a look. -10, -10, -10. And that alone, and then -11, I must have tweaked that. But -10 alone, just adding that to every channel, going to bring the gain down. That means you've got headroom to work with. If you want to increase the volume fader like this, you can, and you've got plenty of room to breathe on your stereo bus. So that is the first step, and that's why I wanted to show you that in a mix. If you're being sent a track by someone else and they've asked you to master it for you, then ask them to do the same thing. Request that they send you a track that's got headroom averaging somewhere between -20 and -15 ideally. Worst case scenario, definitely not peaking above -6, because once you get into that territory, you really don't have a lot to work with. So that's the first step here. Now what I'm going to do is jump into a new project where I've actually bounced this whole track down, imported it into a new project so that I've got a clean project to work with. So here we are in my mastering project, and you can see now we've only got 3 channels, and I recommend doing this because you want to treat it really as a separate phase. You want to finish the mix if you are working on your own mix of music, export it, bounce it down so that you're not tempted to carry on tweaking. Commit to your changes, and if someone else is sending you a stereo track to master for them, then this is what you're going to receive, just a stereo file. So import that into your DAW. I've actually added all the structure markers again just so I can jump around easily. Do that if it helps you, I recommend it, but it's not essential because we're not going to be spending as much time on mastering as mixing. And generally the best thing to do is just loop the loudest section, like I've done here, and put that on loop play. And this is my first tip: always start at the loudest section, because that's going to be where all the problems are. That's where your the levels are going to be at their fullest, so that you can apply compression and limiting there. And it's just generally the best way to work. So loop the loudest section, and then what you should do is import your references. So I've got quite a few here. First of all, I've got the reference of this mix, which is what my friend sent me, and that was his kind of rough mix. So all I'm doing is trying to get a similar vibe, but just a bit more clarity, a bit more of an expensive sound. So this was his mix. So I've got that as one reference. Then I've also got a Radiohead song because I like the sound of this. It's kind of similar. And then more importantly, we've got some Alt-J references because these are very similar. So you can see I'm using loads of references here. You don't have to just use one reference. And the point of references is that we're comparing the track to other tracks so that we can listen out for any major differences. And this is super important. If you don't do this, you won't know if your track's too bassy, too bright, if it's just completely lacking in mid-range, for example. So let's just have a listen to that one. This is Alt-J. Then we've got another Alt-J reference. And finally, another Radiohead. I love using this track as a reference, 15 step, because you've got a really nice acoustic drums there, but with a lot of sub. And then here we've got a full band. So they're the references that I'm going to use, and I kind of jump between them. And then we're back to our track is over here. So let's go through, in this video, compression and limiting. So let's turn these off. When we just import the track, all we're going to have is something that sits around -18, like this. And for the sake of demonstration, I'm just going to bring that volume up so that it's a similar volume to what we just heard. So the first thing we want to do is add compression. I'm going to talk about EQ in the next video. So let's just turn this compressor on and take a look. So for the sake of demonstration here, I'm using all stock plugins, and there's only one plugin I'm using that's not stock, which is just a VU meter. And these meters here do exactly the same thing. So everything else is stock. I don't normally use stock plugins for mastering when I am doing my own tracks, but for here it's more the intent behind each plugin that I want to talk about. So the plugin itself doesn't really matter. So first of all, we're going to use some compression, and because I mixed that track myself, I know that I have already applied some stereo bus compression when I was mixing. So I don't think I'm going to need a lot here. And generally, when you're mastering tracks, the less compressed your track is, the more natural it will sound when you put it through a limiter. So you don't necessarily want to over compress the track, but it's still good just to squeeze a bit more control, where I'm actually using this compressor here more as a tonal device rather than a device for controlling the levels. And what you can see is quite a slow attack time, 29.5 milliseconds, nice slow release, low ratio. I'm actually adding some gain just so I'm bringing the gain up a bit, ready for that limiter. And what I'm doing here is, I'm going to play you this in a second, is just by using a slow attack, I'm letting all the transients of the track through. So if you can imagine, the compressor is reacting quite slowly. So as soon as there's a hit on a snare, for example, that initial transient, the attack of the note, gets through, and then the compressor is clamping down on the rest. And what this means is the music sounds punchy. If we use a really quick attack, it would sound thick and heavy because it's going to clamp down on the attack of the note and that transient of the snare or the bass guitar or the vocal, and it's going to squash that. So that makes it sound thicker and heavier. But instead I want to add punch, so I'm going to go for a slower attack. Now you could use different styles of compressors. If you're not using stock plugins, you could use an SSL style compressor. You could use a VCA if you want it to be a bit more transparent. It doesn't really matter. Give it a go. If it sounds good, go with it. But if you're just using a stock compressor like this, try and use a slower attack. You're less likely to over compress it if you do use a slower attack. So let's have a listen in bypass, and then I'll bring that in. And I'm also going to bring the gain down for now, just so you can hear the difference without that boost in gain. So you can hear it's just adding a bit more energy, a bit more aggression. It's subtle, it's very subtle. But let's just do that again. So this is without compressing. And then with compression. You can see here I'm only going for -2 dB tops. If anything, that's still a bit too aggressive. We want it to be somewhere between -1 and -2. And to tune that in, all I did was made the attack time really fast and then dialed it in, kept making it slower and slower until I liked the amount of aggression in there. And when you're doing that, you can bring down the threshold a bit as well, so that you can hear the compressor pumping. Let's do that. So let's start with really fast. So hopefully you could hear that changing as I brought the attack up. Let's go really slow attack, like about 100. Compare that to this, and you can hear the difference. So I want it somewhere in between. And then the release, you could use a really fast release if you want more apparent volume, but generally I opt for a slower release. I generally go below 500. I think around 200 is what I was working with here. But you just want to adjust that so that it's kind of just the compressor's pumping in time with the music. I'm going to bring the threshold back up now, so that we're just getting 1 dB of gain reduction again. And then I'm just going to adjust this release until the compressor keeps letting go. It keeps going to 0. If the release is too long, it will never return to 0, and we don't want that. But at the same time, I don't want the release to be really fast, because then we might start adding some distortion. It'll start pumping, and you can get away with that if you want that kind of sound, if you want more apparent volume, but I'm going to keep it subtle. So that's the sweet spot there, I think. Let's just show you an example of really slow. If it's too slow, the compressor's not really working because it's just constantly clamping down, so we don't get the variation in the dynamics. And if it's too fast, you can hear how that changes as I move it around. So let's bring that back. So pretty subtle. I've already compressed this, so I'm not going to be too aggressive. If you haven't used any compression on the mix already, then you could use two compressors, one with a fast attack and then another one with a slow attack. That works quite well, but I'm just going to stick to the one here. And then the next thing we're going to do, if I just bring that gain back up, is dial in a limiter. So all a limiter does is catch any peaks and stops them getting any louder. It literally limits them. So whereas a compressor will clamp down on the louder bits depending on how aggressive you have your ratio set, a limiter is different. It will just stop anything going above that level. So if I set the ceiling to minus 0.1, it means the level coming out of this limiter will never go above minus 0.1. So then what we do is just bring the threshold down and keep going down until we see around 2 dB of gain reduction. If you go much more than that, it starts to distort and sound quite bad. Maximum is quite aggressive. So I'll show you that. But the reason you use minus 0.1 is just sometimes when dithering and exporting, if you're at 0, you can get a bit of distortion. So generally it's best to go minus 0.1, maybe even minus 0.2. But what I'm going to do now is just play the track, and I'm going to bring this threshold control down until I start to see around 2 dB of gain reduction. So then after we've done that, we can adjust the release. And again, similar thing, a slower release is going to sound more musical, more natural. Fast release is going to sound more aggressive and can lead to distortion. But you don't want it too slow because then it's not working with the microdynamics, so you want it somewhere in the middle. And then let's back that off so we're getting 2 dB again. And that's all there is to it. Different limiters will have different controls. Generally though, you just want to aim for around 2 dB of gain reduction. If you go more than that, it can start to distort. Which you can hear there quite clearly. So let's bring that back and go back there. And that's it. It's not complicated. Basically, to summarize, what you're doing is you're using gain staging to maintain lots of headroom in the mix so that you have a final mix that's averaging around minus 18, peaking no higher than minus 6. And then what you're doing here when you're mastering is bringing up the gain with either your compressor or the limiter. And then you're using the limiter to stop the music getting any louder than the ceiling. So now we are close to that 0 dB level, and that's fine because we know we're never going to go above it. It's never going to actually distort. We're never going to clip because this limiter is going to stop it ever going above minus 0.2. So you'll see on this channel here, if I set the fader to 0, which is where it should be at now that we've got a limiter on, I'm just going to bring this down a bit so that it's not too loud. You can see this is just staying at minus 0.2. And then I've also just put a limiter on here, again with minus 0.1 on the master fader, just to make sure that's not going over either. So let's compare that to a commercial track. Let's go for Radiohead. So the Radiohead track is louder. Of course it's louder. It's professionally mastered, gone through loads of expensive equipment to get more apparent volume out of it, and lots of other tricks just to make it loud. And this is what the loudness war is all about. But you don't need to do that anymore. That's back in the day where tracks were played on the radio and people would buy CDs and they wanted it to be as loud as possible so people would notice their music and it would sound better, because an increase in volume generally sounds better. But now that people download a lot of their music, they use iTunes, they use iPods, they listen to music on SoundCloud, YouTube, those kind of places, a lot of them now employ technology that automatically volume matches all of the songs. So if you upload your song to iTunes and someone downloads it, even if it's louder than the rest, it will get reduced in volume. Or if it's quieter than the rest, iTunes will automatically boost it in volume. So now that's not really an issue, and it's actually better now to maintain more dynamic range. So you could squeeze the track to get as much volume out of it as possible, but by doing that you sacrifice the range, the dynamic range, which is the difference between the quietest part and the loudest part. So in fact now it's better to be a bit quiet. You're sacrificing some volume, but what you gain in dynamic range will make your mix sound more open, more clear, less claustrophobic, lots of benefits to that. So as long as the volume's similar, if you were listening to these next to each other, you wouldn't notice a huge jump in volume. And if you were listening to them next to each other on your iPod, in most cases, even on YouTube, SoundCloud, I think, and a few other platforms, they would be volume matched anyway. So that's all there is to dynamics. In the next part, we're going to look at EQ, we're going to look at metering, also going to talk about referencing, and I've got a cool referencing trick that I want to show you that makes it really easy to check that your low end is accurate and not too heavy or weak, and that your top end is good as well. So that's all in the next video. Until then, thanks for watching. Go give that a try and let me know how it goes.